Hello. So in this essay, I'm going to talk about Robert McRuer's essay, Compulsory Able-Bodiedness and Queer Disabled Existence. So the purpose in this essay is to basically convey how compulsory heterosexuality and compulsory able-bodiedness are intertwined and they have some parallels to one another. So compulsory heterosexuality can be used as kind of a central concept within disability studies. But at the same time, we have to understand how compulsory able-bodiedness is kind of interwoven into the systems and the structures of compulsory heterosexuality. So compulsory able-bodiedness basically kind of produces disability as something that is a deviation, as an alternative, as something that's not normal, and that's very similar to what happens with compulsory heterosexuality and homosexuality or anything that's not heterosexual, but it's a lot more intense with compulsory able-bodiedness when it comes to the pathologization in terms of how Robert McRuer is discussing it. So these systems of compulsory able-bodiedness and compulsory heterosexuality are really contingent upon one another to exist. So they kind of reinforce one another. So in order to understand the author's overall argument, we have to understand what compulsory heterosexuality is. So compulsory heterosexuality normalizes and naturalizes heterosexuality as the kind of ideal way of existing, just assuming people are heterosexual, assuming that it's something that everyone wants to be, assuming that it's just something that is natural within us, and that if you are not that, then you are deviant in some way. So it comes at the expense of non-hetero identity, so homosexuality, bisexuality, pansexuality, etc. And what happens then if you view something as a norm or natural, then it ends up subjugating other types of identities and marginalizing them. And what's happened over the past, I guess, 40 years or so, 50 years or so, is that more marginalized identities have been studied. So, feminist theory, critical race theory, queer theory, disability theory. However, what ends up happening is that we can't just study one thing without studying the more dominant identity. We also need some sort of interrogation of the more dominant identity. So, for example, if we're studying feminist theory and what it means to be a woman in our society, we have to understand masculinity and male privilege and things like that. If we're studying queer theory, we have to understand how heterosexuality exists. If we're studying blackness or post-colonial theory, we have to understand whiteness and kind of Eurocentricness and things like that. So this is basically how these identities exist in relation to one another. And the author turns to the Oxford English Dictionary, which is an example of how heterosexuality is viewed as a dominant identity. So it's institutionalized as, quote, the normal relation of the sexes, right? So it's normalizing heterosexuality. And so if something is viewed as normal, then you are creating a compulsion to act in that way. You're creating a compulsion to act in the normal way. So there's an appearance of choice to be, heterosexual or not heterosexual, but in terms of a society where heterosexuality is compulsive, then people feel the pressure to be heterosexual and live up to that identity. And if you're not, then you're failing and you're deviant in some way. So how is this connected to the disability rights movement? Well, there's that, again, the author is critiquing the notion that being able-bodied is normal, and being something that's not able-bodied or someone that is not able-bodied in terms of how it's viewed in our society is deviant. So being able-bodied is viewed as natural and normal, whereas being disabled in some way is not natural and normal. And so the author uses an example of a Salon article where the author talked about you either have an able body or you don't, right? It's basically oversimplified and doesn't understand kind of the complexity of identity and reality. And so it's just a way to justify compulsory able-bodiedness. If you're not able-bodied, then you are invisible. Then you're rendered as something that is deviant and even non-existent in the way it's talked about in this article. And also, turning back to the Oxford English Dictionary, they define able-bodied as being, quote, free from disability. And this is similar to how heterosexuality is defined in this dictionary, because they also defined it as being the opposite of homosexuality. So it's viewed as you're free from something, you're not this deviant identity. It's compulsory able-bodiedness is also identified as defined as the ability to work, so the ability to sell one's labor. So you are viewed as free to sell your labor, but you're not free to do anything else. So again, the appearance of choice when there really isn't a choice in the system. You have to be able-bodied. You have to appear to be able-bodied. And so this happens through multiple systems in our society, multiple assumptions that we make, as what the author refers to as the disciplines of normality. So when people ask someone who is hard of hearing or vision impaired, wouldn't you rather not be hard of hearing, or wouldn't you rather not be vision impaired? Or wouldn't you rather not be in a wheelchair, right? So it's these repeated demands from people, or when people talk to individuals who are not heterosexual. Oh, wouldn't you rather naturally want to have kids, or have this ideal nuclear family structure, right? There's this assumption that what's viewed as able-bodied or heterosexual is ideal, and it's what you want to be doing rather than something that you're just kind of stuck with in a way if you aren't that way. So it's assuming that being able-bodied and heterosexual are preferable and what we should all be aiming for in our society. So this is where the author discusses Judith Butler's theory of gender, where there's this repetitive performance of heterosexuality, this repetitive performance of able-bodiedness that is bound to fail. It's something we're always performing constantly, but no one can ever really live up to the ideal able-bodied subject or the ideal heterosexual identity, because we're all inevitably going to experience some sort of disability as we age. And then when it comes to heterosexuality, right, performing masculinity, femininity 100% perfectly all the time in our relationships, right, that's something that's impossible. So this notion of having this ideal able-bodied identity and this ideal heterosexual identity are linked in their mutual impossibility and incomprehensibility, right? They're ideals that no one can really perfectly adhere to or live up to, but they're still expected of us for some reason, right? They're still expected of us as a way of being viewed as valid and as important people in our society. So heterosexuality and able-bodiedness are the foundation for all other identities that no one can really truly live up to when it comes to our lives. And so this is where Judith Butler kind of coined this term gender trouble, right, where you're not able to live up to compulsory heterosexuality and perform in that way. And the author compares it to ability trouble, right, because you're not able to live up to that compulsory able-bodied identity. So in the next video then, I'm going to talk about the author's analysis of a queer disabled existence and alternatives to this notion of compulsory heterosexuality and compulsory able-bodiedness.